Hello, welcome into this week's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Higley. In this week's episode, we're talking about the box squat. And I want to approach this topic carefully because anytime that someone says they default to a certain lift or a movement, then the internet immediately turns that into a tribal argument. High bar versus low bar, Olympic squatting versus powerlifting squatting, full range of motion versus partial ranges, and now box squat versus everything else. That's not what this episode is. I still love regular squats, and I still program high bar and front bar squats regularly. There are phases where even split squat variations are the primary lower body lift that I'll program. There are times when I intentionally want more knee travel, more of an upright torso, more quad emphasis. But if you look at my training over the last several years and you look at how I program for most of the athletes that I work with, the box squat shows up more often than anything else. It's not nostalgia. It's not me trying to cosplay West Side Barbell. It's a programming decision. And I'll be transparent. I first started thinking seriously about the box squat because of folks like Louie Simmons of West Side Barbell and Joe DeFranco. I read Louie's books and I read articles, and certain terminology stuck with me. The way that Louie talked about starting strength, the way he emphasized recuperation, the way he obsessed over the first rep of a movement. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to copy 1990s West Side programming. We're not geared powerlifters. That context matters here. The underlying principles, when you strip away the mythology of it, are still very relevant today. So I want to walk through why the box squat tends to be my default for lower body strength variations. And I also want to talk about when it's not. I want to do this mechanically and practically. Now, the first thing that changed my thinking about the box squat was mechanical. Most people, when they squat, they descend almost straight down. Their knees travel forward. Their torso stays relatively upright. And that is a perfectly valid squat pattern. But when you squat to a box properly, and properly matters here, you don't drop straight down. You sit back. That subtle shift changes the geometry of the lift. So when the hips travel further behind you, behind the bar, you increase the horizontal distance between the hip joint and the line of force. That then increases the hip moment demand. That doesn't mean that the quads no longer work within the lift. It means that the relative contribution now shifts. In simpler terms, you're asking the hip extensors, the glutes, the adductors, portions of the hamstrings to contribute more relative force. Now, here's where I want to be clear. A regular back squat absolutely trains the glutes and the hamstrings. This isn't an exclusion, it's bias. Now, if we zoom in a little bit more mechanically, what we're really talking about is distributing torque. So when you sit back and reduce that forward knee travel, you're decreasing the knee extensor moment relative to a more knees forward squat. And that changes the contribution pattern at the hip versus the knee. But it also changes the trunk angle. A slightly more inclined torso increases the demand on the spinal erectors to resist flexion. So now you're not just biasing hip extension, but you're increasing isometric trunk extension demand as well. And that matters because many lifters don't fail a squat due to quad weakness, but they fail because they lose that trunk position under heavy load. Now, what the box gives me is a clean and repeatable way to bias hip loading without constantly cueing it. If I have an athlete who is more quad dominant, who struggles to sit back, who collapses into their knees, then the box becomes a constraint that teaches that pattern almost automatically. Now, Louie would emphasize keeping the shins perpendicular or even slightly past perpendicular when sitting back. Now, I wouldn't dogmatically apply that to everyone, but the underlying idea is still sound. When the shin stays closer to vertical, the anterior knee moment is relatively reduced compared to a knees forward squat. The stress distribution, therefore, shifts. Again, doesn't make it universally safer, but it makes it different. And sometimes that variety is exactly what the athlete needs. Now, the second thing, and this is where Louie's language really stuck with me, is what happens at the bottom of the lift. So in a traditional squat, especially if you descend with intent, you store elastic energy in that muscle tendon system. And then when you reverse quickly, some of that stored energy contributes to the concentric phase of the movement. It's not cheating, it's physiology. But when you sit on a box and you pause, and even briefly, you reduce that stretch shortening cycle contribution from that rapid reversal. You don't eliminate it. You don't eliminate the elasticity, because that's impossible. The muscles and tendons are elastic tissues, but you dampen the rebound, and that changes the character of the lift. Now you're asking the athlete to produce force from a lower velocity starting point. So if we want to get even more specific, the stretch shortening cycle relies on stored elastic energy in the tendon and on potentiation effects from the eccentric phase. When you descend rapidly and you reverse up immediately, you're taking advantage of both passive elastic recoil and reflexive neural contributions. By pausing on a box, even briefly, you will allow some of that stored elastic energy to dissipate. The reflexive contribution is reduced, so the concentric phase becomes more dependent on voluntary motor unit recruitment rather than stored energy transfer, especially at the start of the contraction, when the velocity is lowest and inertia is highest. That changes the neural demand of the lift. And Louie used to talk about static overcome by dynamic. Again, that phrase stuck with me. You settle on the box, the system stabilizes, and then you initiate force. Now, for everyday high performers, this matters not because they need a 200-pound carryover to a meat squat, but because force production from a disadvantaged or paused position is common in life and in sport. You don't always get a perfectly timed preload. Sometimes you have to produce force from stillness. And the box squat gives me a structured way to be able to train that. Now that ties into another idea that Louie would hammer constantly, the first rep. So he used to say that the first rep is the most important rep. And when you think about it, he's right. That first rep in any set is the most honest. There's no rhythm yet. There's no stored tension from the previous repetitions. So in a box squat, every rep becomes a version of a first rep. You're repeatedly overcoming inertia from near zero velocity, which means that you're repeatedly training that initial force impulse instead of just riding the rhythm of a set. And that's a different stimulus than bouncing through 5 continuous smooth repetitions. Now, I want to be careful here. If you want maximal peak rate of force development, then I'm going to program jumps or sprints. The weight room still doesn't compete with that in terms of velocity, but if I want to build starting strength under load, the ability to generate force early in the concentric phase, then the box squat is a very efficient way to do it. Now, from a force velocity standpoint, initiating force from near zero velocity requires high force production at the low end of that force velocity curve. When you remove momentum and the elastic contribution, you now increase the relative demand on the early phase force production, what some would call the first 100 to 200 milliseconds of a contraction. Now again, if we're chasing that maximal rate of force development, then sprinting and jumping are going to win. But under load, in a strength building context, repeatedly training force production from a dead stop increases an athlete's ability to recruit those high threshold motor units without relying on the assistance from a rebound. And that's very valuable. Now, here's where this becomes especially relevant for my audience. Most of the athletes that I work with are not only lifting, they're running, they're conditioning, they're pushing their aerobic development, and they're also balancing their careers and families and stress. And once you operate in a concurrent model of training strength plus endurance, then fatigue management becomes a constraint for you. Louie would use the term recuperation, and he believed that you could train more frequently on a box than with regular squats. Now, I wouldn't universally agree with that because load and volume matter and the execution matters, but the principle is worth examining. With deep, high volume squats, with that aggressive stretch loading, those create significant eccentric stress, and that drives muscle damage. And then muscle damage drives soreness and increases the recovery demand. So if I'm running 15 to 25 miles per week, I don't want or need that unnecessary damage from my primary squat variation. And so what I've found in myself and in the athletes that I work with is that box squats often produce a much more manageable recovery curve. So the depth is controlled, the position is consistent, and the stretch reflex contribution is dampened. The eccentric can be controlled tightly with this. And part of this likely comes down to eccentric loading magnitude and the muscle tendon strain. So deep, high velocity eccentrics increase that fascicle stretch and passive tension within the muscle tendon unit. And then that increases mechanical disruption and various inflammatory signaling post-session. So with box squats, especially when the eccentric is controlled and depth is fixed, you often reduce excessive in-range strain. You're still loading heavily, but the stretch-mediated damage component may be lower. It's not zero damage, it's just a slightly different stress profile. And in a concurrent training model, even small differences in muscle damage can meaningfully affect running mechanics and perceived recovery. There's also a technical honesty to the lift. The box eliminates any ambiguity about depth. As weights get heavier, lifters will tend to cut their squats a little bit high. It happens all the time. But with the box, once you establish the height, then every single rep has an objective standard. You either reach it or you don't. And that consistency makes longitudinal progress easier to track. So for everyday athletes who are not training in front of judges, that objectivity matters. It keeps the lift consistent across weeks. From a motor control standpoint, the box also increases proprioceptive awareness at end range. You're teaching the nervous system to stabilize in a deeper hip flex position before initiating extension. That pause then improves your postural awareness under that load, which can improve consistency from rep to rep. And consistency is a very underrated training variable. Now, here's the important pivot. The box squat is not one lift. The stimulus changes dramatically depending on how you use it. So a high box is very different from a low box. If I raise the box, then I reduce the knee flexion demand and I increase that relative hip dominance. And that can be useful in various intensification phases or when we're managing certain joint stress. Now, if I drop the box significantly below parallel, I'm increasing hip flexion demand and overall tissue stress. That's not something that I throw in casually, right? The box height is a programming variable, just like stance width is a programming variable. Louie would adjust box height based off of sticking points. So 2 inches above parallel if that's where the athlete missed the lift, maybe below parallel to build power out of the hole. And that specificity still makes sense, but for everyday lifters, I'm not chasing sticking points for competition attempts. I'm using those adjustments to bias tissue adaptation intentionally. And intent changes it even more. So a max effort box squat is not the same stimulus as a dynamic effort box squat at say 60 to 75% with maximal intent. It's the same movement, but completely different neural demands. Additionally, bar choice changes everything. So a safety squat bar increases trunk demand and it challenges that thoracic extension. It's phenomenal for athletes who fold forward under load. Now, a cambered bar introduces that instability and forces more of your positional control. We also have a buffalo bar, which can reduce shoulder stress and allow for longer training cycles. The box is the constraint. The rest of the setup defines the adaptation. Now let's talk about when I use it. So if I'm emphasizing Olympic lifting mechanics, then the classic upright torso, deep knee flexion, quad dominant movement, I'm squatting differently. If I'm chasing quad hypertrophy specifically, then I may bias deeper knees, forward squats. If an athlete needs adaptation to deep knee flexion under load, then maybe they've avoided it for too long, then I'm going to, use that. I'm not going to hide them behind a box forever. And if someone can't maintain tension on the box, say they rock or they relax at the bottom or they collapse, then we regress the movement. The box only works if it's used correctly. Now, Louie would say, sit completely on the box and flex off of it. Maintain that tension, except for releasing the hip flexors. That level of technical precision matters. For everyday athletes, I cue it a bit more simply by just saying stay tight, don't rock, own that position, and drive through the movement. So when I say I default to the box squat, what I really mean is this. For the problems that I most often see, quad dominance, weak starting strength, poor positional control, fatigue interference, and that concurrent training environment, it solves those problems efficiently. Not universally and not exclusively, but efficiently. And good programming is about efficient problem solving. The box squat isn't better. It's useful. And it's another tool in our movement toolbox. And for most everyday high performers, the people who are balancing strength with conditioning, with life, and long-term durability, that usefulness makes it worth defaulting to more often than not. That's why it stays in my rotation. Not because Louie said so, not because it's edgy, but because mechanically and practically, it just makes sense. And in strength training, if something consistently makes mechanical and physiological sense, it tends to stick around. So thanks for listening to the Everyday Strength Podcast. If today's episode helped you learn something, do me a favor and make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. This helps the show grow and it ensures that you never miss an episode. If you're on YouTube, drop a comment. I read all of them. And if you're on Apple or Spotify, then a quick 5-star review goes a long way in pushing this information to more people. If you want to go deeper, then join the Performance Edge Network. It's free to join and it gets you access to my weekly newsletter, which is full of training breakdowns, physiology deep dives, and tools that you can apply immediately to become a stronger, fitter, higher performing everyday athlete. And if you're ready for structured programming, then I've got options for whatever path you're on. The Peak Performance Training Program is my flagship strength and conditioning program. And I also offer Peak 3X, which is a 3-day per week version for busier athletes, along with other programs designed for hybrid competitors, runners, and anyone who wants to train like an athlete year round. You can find all those and more at HagleyStrength.com. I appreciate you being here. Keep training hard, and I'll see you in the next episode.